Welcome everybody to International Trade Live. My name is Joseph Clark and I'm the editor of International Trade magazine. In this big interview session, I am joined by Chris Smedley, the CEO of Landways, designer and provider of digital and power infrastructure and mission-critical technology systems for high-density venues and logistics sites. Chris, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. Before we delve into the changes that we're currently seeing in the logistics sector, and more specifically technological advances in warehousing, could you just give us a little bit of background of how you got to where you are today?
Sure. So personally, I actually started life as a lawyer some time ago, but I saw the light and decided to join at the time up and growing telecoms company. This is about just 25 years ago or so. I had a career in telecoms that lasted for about 15 years in sort of pure play telecoms. Sold a business, and that involved meeting some investors from the US who were very interested in what we had done as a team previously in our last business, using things like optical fiber, the latest kind of technology for what we used to do is connect data centers together. We were the kind of networks behind companies like TalkTalk and O2. And applying some of those innovations to different sectors, particularly in building and kind of large high density sites where there were quite a lot of challenges. So we ended up setting up the Landways business a few years ago, initially focused on sports arena, but over the last year or so, we've been focusing hard on logistics and in the industrial sector as well.
Okay, so what are the principal changes that you've seen in the last few years taking place in the logistics sector?
I think what's really interesting, I mean, the themes I think are quite well recognised. The introduction of more technology into the sector, the use of automation, the use of data to track from end to end and throughout the supply chain how goods are being transferred and finding efficiencies. The push for sustainability across the sector, all in different forms, whether it's in building or whether it's in the transportation fleets themselves. So for us, there's quite a lot of commonality in the way that our business has been set up and the things we've done elsewhere, where we're bringing together, if you like, the latest technology on the digital side with some very new technology for how power is delivered to sites as well.
So you obviously came into this industry with a lot of expertise, a lot of previous knowledge in technology. Have you found that those working in the logistics industry often lack that knowledge?
I think actually it's a really mixed picture. There's actually a huge amount of innovation that's taken place globally, quite a lot of it in the UK. It's interesting to see Ocado in the news today, for example, around their latest results. You've got an example there of a business that's a real thought leader in how automation should be done for the retail sector in particular, based in this country, that it's actually ended up licensing its technology on a global basis. So I think there's some really bright spots of technology development inside this, both the UK and globally. But equally, you'll find across the sector sites that are still really just sheds, still very much dependent upon human labour, not using data particularly intelligently, and probably quite a long way to go. But no, I think the signs are pretty good actually when you look across the sector that the waves of change are coming.
Okay, and when you mentioned those companies that perhaps need a little bit more training when it comes to use of technology, do you think there's a correlation between smaller companies, or does that also occur in the bigger enterprises?
I think it's easier for the bigger businesses to be the early adopters, and I think that's common across most new developments. We've seen it in the technology space for quite a long time. The first people that started using data centers, for example, tended to be the large banks and people that had both the resources and the need to invest in technology. So I don't think it's surprising to see things starting at that end. I think where it gets really interesting is when the technology is adopted by third-party players that can then make it easier for smaller and medium-sized companies to avail themselves of those things as well. So I think it's a natural evolution. It's not just with technology as it relates to things like automation and the use of data. It's also to do with the technologies that help make sites more power efficient. So, for example, the use of solar panels, the use of batteries, and thinking about new ways that might require some capital investment up front in order to get the thing moving. I think our own business is hopefully an example of somebody that can break down some of those barriers and make it a bit easier for all parts of the market to avail themselves of the technology. And one of the things we do, for example, is we offer to finance these systems to take away that initial barrier of, potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds of capital to make that leap into something that's more efficient.
Okay, you've just mentioned there some of the standout technological developments that you've seen in warehousing. What are the challenges, the main challenges that are being presented to warehouse operators in their quest for higher tech facilities?
I think what's probably never fully appreciated is that there's no silver magic bullet here that will just make everything happen really quickly and easily. That actually the process of digitization is something that runs deep through all aspects of a business. And to do that requires a commitment to change, across all levels. So you're thinking about things like, how the finance function might work, or, operationally how data is gathered together, the impact that it might have on your customers and how you relate to them, the dashboards that you would like to evolve and how you actually run the business. So I think there's the amount of change that comes in isn't as simple as just saying, let's put great connectivity in place and buy a package of software from somebody else. It requires change. You can't sort of give it to like the digital team in the business. It actually impacts virtually on everybody that works within it. And I think that process is something that's really difficult for any business to get their heads around. We see it in other sectors that we work in as well. You often end up with legacy systems that need to be migrated away from. That can be pretty complex. And of course, you've got a live business to run at the same time. So there's risk in change. And I think for a lot of people, that's probably what stops them. They probably feel quite naturally that this is a place that they want to go and that they want to invest in, but they can see the hurdles and they can see the risks. And for some businesses, it's probably quite natural just to sit back a little bit and wait for the model to really get proven out, perhaps by some of those early adopters.
Yeah, I guess another challenge as well would be the fact that as well as wanting to boost performance in the warehouses, they also need to comply with regulations on carbon emissions. And at the same time, they'll be wanting to keep costs as low as possible. What do you think is an effective way for them to achieve this?
So I think really there should be a happy meeting place between both those objectives. As I say, the cost of change can be significant for people, and trying to minimise that's an important way forward. But I think the cases, particularly carbon reduction of emissions, have got easier recently because of the energy crisis. The business case for solar panels, for example, the business case for using batteries to store energy, the business case for putting more efficient, say, lighting systems in, making those investments was probably quite easily justified purely in terms of carbon reduction previously. And those numbers don't particularly change, but the cost of the energy is now so much higher that it makes those business cases easier to justify. So the payback periods are shorter. It's more obvious why you should be looking at it. I think also, in other geographies around the world, and I think increasingly here as well, people are also concerned about things like the resilience of your energy supply. And they realise that the site becomes so dependent on power as you move to electrification, as you move to different ways of minimising fossil fuels, diesel generators, even forklift trucks that are still operating using fuel. As you're trying to get those out of your system, you're making the case for carbon reduction. Are you also making the case for cost reduction at the same time? And are you making the case for resilience in case there is a failure in energy supply from the grid? Because the costs to businesses of downtime are equally significant to the costs of paying too much for your energy.
And in your experience, do you think that the UK are progressing in these aspects? Do you feel optimistic about the progression that you're seeing?
I do. I think since we've taken our proposition into this sector, we've been overwhelmed really by the response and just how many people, first of all, how it coincides with the objectives that a lot of these businesses have. And people are taking carbon reduction seriously. So they are interested in any techniques, especially if they're ones they've not really come across before, to help meet those goals and to reduce their energy usage. They've also got these other trends coming their way, things like electrification of vehicle fleets, starting with things like forklift trucks inside their buildings, automation itself and different forms of robotic devices that may be used inside these sites. They all need power, they all need data, and they need to be done so sustainably. So I think that, judging from the response that we've had, I think people take those goals very seriously. I think there's real alignment in understanding what these big themes are that are coming down the track. It's very interesting looking at the US market, which I think is recognised to be a couple of years ahead in a lot of these steps. The scale of investment there in robotics and automation and the use of data that underpins that business case and how those sites are operated is very impressive. A lot of the first companies that have gone into that market are coming to Europe, often brought here by the same clients, global businesses that are using those technologies over in the US and want to use them here in Europe. So I think when you start to get that cross-pollination of ideas and the presence of some of those players in our market as well as in North America, then it becomes a bit easier to see why that change is going to be made.
Yeah. And moving on to something slightly different, could you explain to us the upgrade, scale and streamline principle?
I think for us, and what we understand by that anyway, it's something that's pretty important to thinking about the use of technology and power inside any large building, certainly any key operational site. And a lot of technology in the past tends to have a real short life cycle to it and a kind of rip and replace mentality that comes in. So you kind of use buy the latest and greatest technology, deploy it, works pretty well when you first put it in, and then over time it becomes obsolete or outdated or not performing quite as well as it did. And you'd find that in things like Wi-Fi networks, lighting systems, security camera systems. Just technology tends not to last very well. For us, having an underlying infrastructure in your site that you can easily upgrade, you will always end up having short lifespan, things like, say, a camera. And there will be a higher resolution version that comes out in a few years' time. There'll be wear and tear to the edge device. How easily and quickly can you swap out the old one for the new one and upgrade your system seamlessly so that you can carry on with your, in that case, a security camera system around the site? Can you do the same thing with a lighting system? Modern lighting systems run over new technology that is efficient using LEDs, and a big improvement in terms of power efficiency from old halogen systems, which can still be found in many operational sites still in use. Those systems still degrade over time. So can you deploy an infrastructure that will actually hold you harmless against some of those things, keep performance up over time, and allow you to scale and grow as you need to, both with fundamental systems like lighting that you're going to need for a long time, but also as these new technologies come into the site, will you be able to quickly adapt and avail yourself of them, because you've got a system and an infrastructure both for data and for power in the site that allows you to do so.
Okay, and moving then away from inside the warehouse to getting the goods from the warehouse out, transportation methods. Have you seen any, are there any similar changes that have taken place and also challenges regarding those transport methods?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the thing that we see most, we're obviously in building specialists, so we're kind of our focus is on the logistics sites themselves. But obviously, these are receiving goods, and those things are being brought to them throughout a variety of different ways. And you've also got obviously people working in the sites who are coming and going to the site as well. So for us, the biggest sign of all of that has been the introduction of EV charging to these sites. As I say, starting off with the material handling equipment inside the sites, converting from a variety of different forms of power for forklift trucks and other vehicles that are used inside the depots, but also then looking at the fleets themselves. It's interesting now, if you look at a typical new build site, most local planning authorities will mandate that the site is built with a certain number of electric vehicle charging points. Those are very power hungry, and even just putting, say 20% of the car park with facilities like that. And for us, that's something when you're looking at all of the power requirements of the site that you have to take into account, because there's a significant and significantly growing amount of power usage that comes from providing that kind of power. And the fleets themselves, I think it's pretty clear that most people are thinking that the smaller vehicles, vans, etc., up to a certain size will also be coming electric over the similar time frame to most domestic cars. And I think there's still a lot of debate about the right type of technology for HGVs. Hydrogen fuel cells are often mentioned. It's not necessarily just going to be batteries, given the size and the amount of energy required to power those fleets. But that's in play as well. So for us, it's just yet another thing that has to be thought about in the round when you're thinking about exactly what's being charged up, if you like, through electricity at the site. And it's one that probably has got most people scratching their heads about how are you going to do it. And it's one thing to make a site more efficient in terms of its energy usage as things currently stand. But when you start introducing robotics, automation, more technology, higher quality systems, your kind of power requirement is going up at the same time as you're trying to make it more efficient and to use less power. But the EV thing, which is clearly a desirable outcome compared to fossil fuels, but it's making the actual total size of the pie, if you like, of electricity usage at these sites much, much larger.
Yeah, I imagine again, thinking about bigger enterprises and then SMEs, as the bigger companies have obviously much more resources, it's possibly easier for them to incorporate the EV systems into their warehouses. Are we seeing much progression with SMEs in this aspect as well, or do you think it's much more of a struggle for them?
No, I don't think it's necessarily a struggle. I think the making that business case in the first place, as I say, it's easier when you can see that it's worked well for other people. Also because prices themselves tend to come down as the early adopters, as the market expands. That you'd see that obviously with things like a domestic television set. The kind of new big ones always cost a bit more, and then within a few years' time, they're kind of being sold for the same price as today's sort of average size set. And something similar, I think, happens in terms of most form of technology. So there's a natural curve where I think that will be available to the wider market anyway. But also, I think companies like ourselves, where you're taking away that hurdle of the initial capital investment, what we do is offer to put up the capital for the initial systems that are deployed in a site, and then basically run a service for companies, whether they're the owners of the sites or the tenants of the sites, to basically deliver the services back to them, whether it's lighting or connectivity for Wi-Fi, any in-building technology, and to run it for them as a service. And I think that's a key part of the sort of how you make this into more of a, if you like, a mass market adoption thing, is to remove that kind of initial barrier of the capital.
Okay, so do you think then that the logistics sector, in terms of reaching net zero in 2050, do you think that the logistics sector is on the right track?
I think it is. As I said before, the seriousness with which people are taking carbon reduction, if you just look at the rollout of things like solar panels across the sector, it's pretty dramatic. The amount and the pace of change. And that's not just like a few solar panels on the roof to kind of tick a box and say, I'm using solar. It's actually working with companies like ours who are then scaling it to be a very significant proportion of the total energy usage of the site. Obviously, solar panels work really well in the summer, less so in the winter. So then you're seeing people looking at technologies like battery storage so that they can avail themselves, for example, of low energy tariffs that you can get overnight, often driven from offshore wind projects. There's quite a few energy companies that specialize in doing that. One of the things that we do is we actually put the batteries into these sites, partly so you can store excess solar energy during the summer. But a lot of people limit their solar deployments to how much energy they can actually use there and then. But if you can store excess, you've got a case for deploying more solar panels than otherwise would be the case. And in the winter, you've got a battery system that can then be used to store overnight energy or off-peak and cheaper energy, which tends to be green energy, from the grid, and then use it during your daytime operations. So every site's slightly different. Some people are running 24/7 sites. Some people are running sites that are mainly based on nighttime operation. But that sort of flexibility of use of different green energy resources, solar, wind, and even on-site wind. I think people are now thinking seriously about wind turbines on site to kind of balance out what's happening with the use of solar, which, as I say, is very strong in the summer. Wind tends to be the opposite in the winter. So you end up with this very strong contribution to your site's energy requirements coming from delivering and generating your own energy on site, together with a more limited use of the grid. One of the other things that we're noticing people really interested in are new technologies like DC microgrids. Partly because of resilience from the grid and giving yourself that kind of long backup period so that if there is an outage, you can carry on operating. But also because DC devices tend to proliferate across these sites. So this is really down in the details of electrical systems. But as you know from your own home or office, most electrical distribution networks operate over alternating current. Most devices sitting on the edge of them today are actually consuming direct current, which means you constantly have to convert the energy between the two different types. That produces quite a lot of wasted energy through heat. If you can eradicate that, there's further efficiencies to be found. And that's one of the big things that we do. So we're kind of combining this DC microgrid technology with solar, with battery storage. And across the whole piece on a typical site, that can save up to the fifth of the energy usage at the site. And that's the kind of innovation that we're pushing forward, that, as I say, we're seeing people adopt and take interest in at a pretty rapid rate, which tells me that people are pretty serious about this.
Okay, and just to finish then, what predictions do you have for the next coming years in terms of increased technology use and also our quest to reach net zero?
I think on the net zero one, I think we're just on this curve now where the various techniques that people can see, that the pretty obvious ones, electrification, fleet, greater efficiency, is being adopted and will continue to be so. So I think we'll just see that start to trickle down throughout the whole sector over that time period. I think for me, the one that's going to be most interesting is the pace of adoption of automation within sites, the increased reliance upon machines for moving things around inside those sites, and behind it, the necessary investment in data and the use of data to find those efficiencies and run the sites differently. And I think there's probably going to be a number of new players that enter the UK and European logistics sector, offering companies help with that transition. That's not something that Landways itself does directly. We supply the systems that actually, if you like, enable all these transformations on both the power and the digital side with the systems themselves. But for us, there's a very natural partnership with the advisors, the consultants, and the companies who can then actually run those parallel systems. So for me, robotics and automation and the kind of shift towards that, underpinned by the use of data, is probably the biggest trend we see coming.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that insight and knowledge with us. I think those watching will definitely take away a lot from this talk and certainly feel very optimistic about the so thank you very much. And we look forward to speaking to you again in the future.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.